To understand the book of 1 Corinthians, we have to get a background from Acts 18. Paul travels to Corinth around 51 AD. He has this zeal to spread the gospel, and he begins to preach the gospel of Christ in this wild city called Corinth. It is a melting pot. It is many cultures that have come together in the city of Corinth. He meets this Jewish couple, Aquila and Priscilla. They, like he, are tent makers, and so they begin to involve themselves in the business of tent making. Every chance Paul gets, he goes and he preaches in the synagogue. But the Jews, it says, were hostile and blasphemous. And so Paul began to focus his ministry on the Gentiles, and there were many Gentiles who believed and they were baptized. It was in this place that there was a formation of a church. A foundation was laid by Paul. And there was this church that was beginning to blossom. In fact, it says that Paul stayed a year and a half. So he spends a year and a half in Corinth. It says that his heart became welded to the Corinthians as he watched them come to Christ and grow in their faith. In the autumn of 52 AD, Paul leaves Corinth with Aquila and Priscilla, and he sets sail for Ephesus. And there they come in contact with a young man named Apollos. In Acts chapter 18, verse 24, we read these words, "Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor, and he taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John." Verse 26, "He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. And when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. On arriving, he was a great help to those by the grace that he had believed in." So it says that he vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. In this passage, Apollos becomes a key man in building the church at Corinth. And Paul writes a letter to the church of Corinth. We don't believe that this was the book of 1 Corinthians, but we believe that it was a letter written before the book of 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, it says, "I have written you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people." So how do we know that this letter that Paul refers to is not 1 Corinthians? Well, there's been a lot of diversity of opinion by various theologians. Theodore Ocumenus, most of the Latin commentators, nearly all of the Dutch commentators suppose that this refers to the same epistle. But there are many others such as Grotius, Doddridge, Rosenmuller, and many others that refer to it as some epistle which is now lost. How would we know? First, it's obvious that everybody to whom he was writing already knew about the letter. Clearly, they understood what Paul was speaking about. Secondly, it was probable that Paul had written more letters than the 14 that we now have preserved. Third, we know that there are books of the Bible that have been lost. The Old Testament refers to the book of Jasher, if you go over to Joshua chapter 10, verse 13. Or there's the book of Edu the seer. Let's look at 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 29. Listen to these words. "Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, first and last, are they not written in the book of Nathan the prophet?" So there we have one book. "Are they not written in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the visions of Edu the seer against Jeroboam the son of Nebat?" So we have 3 books that are mentioned, and we don't find them in the Old Testament. So we have to believe that there were other letters, possibly other books, that we have not yet discovered in respect to the New Testament. Yes, the Bible that we have has been canonized, but quite possibly there are other letters out there which Paul wrote that we don't have as part of our Bible. And then fourth, he uses in 1 Corinthians chapter 5:11, but now I have written. It's saying, but now in this epistle I have written, which distinguishes this letter from the former letter. So clearly, there were other letters that Paul was referring to, and we have to believe that there was a letter written before what we now call the book of 1 Corinthians. As we look at 1 Corinthians, we make some very quick discoveries about that letter. It's broken up into 4 areas. One we see is the introduction. Secondly, we see a series of rebuke for sin. Thirdly, we see a number of replies to questions. And finally, we see the conclusion. So we're going to take a look at some of these ideas, and I want you to give your full attention with your Bibles open as we look at the book of 1 Corinthians.